3CR Radiothon 2024. Sound on for solidarity.
Coming up is a podcast brought to you by the dedicated and diverse volunteers at 3CR. Just a quick message before you get there. For the month of June, we're asking listeners to donate to the station to help us keep going. We rely on the generous donations of community to survive. Go to 3cr.org.au/donate and show your support for community-owned and community-run media. Thanks for your support and happy listening.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. The Wonder What Anarchy is all about, anarchos without rulers. It's about creating a society without rulers, R-U-L-E-R-S. And I'm not talking about the ones you use to measure distance, but rulers. It's and what gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people, as we see every day on the planet Earth? Inequalities in power and wealth. That's right, inequalities in power and wealth. So, what's the anarchist struggle? The struggle to share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Exceptionally conservative concepts, things that people have been struggling for since time immemorial. Mutual aid, collectivism, the list goes on and on. It's about, living, let living, the list goes on and on, as I keep saying. So if you are involved in that struggle to share power, share wealth, well, whether you call yourself an anarchist or not, you are. That's right. All right, let's move on. Funny, isn't it? There's a lot to laugh about in life, especially living in Australia in 2024. Because, you see, we've got an attitude which is called palatable inequality. Palatable, you like that? Something is palatable. We're actually able to stomach it, eat it, digest it, and let it poop in the toilet. Palatable inequality. And the beauty about living in Australia in 2024 is that palatable inequality is beginning to cause a little bit of community indigestion. That's right. I think in the past we accepted the fact that there was inequality. But what's happened in the last 30 to 40 years is that that gap has become so extensive, so large, so extraordinary that people are beginning to feel that it's not quite right. It's not palatable that over 1 million children in this country of 26 million people live in poverty. It's not palatable the amount of taxpayers' money that goes into corporate welfare. And you can divide corporate welfare into a number of categories. There's the direct government handouts to corporate organisations, as we see in the renewable energy debate, the coal industry, the mineral industry. So there's that direct, taking out of the Treasury and giving it to the corporate sector because they're good people. They create jobs. They're good people. They're really good people, the corporate sector. They create jobs, don't they? Then there's the other type of corporate welfare. It's, when you have legislation which is passed in Parliament which gives them an advantage in taxation. This country's taxation laws are a classical example of corporate welfare, where many corporations pay voluntary taxation, while the rest of us is expected to fill up the trough to ensure that people get the minimal services they require. Then you got palatable inequality as far as education is concerned. You know, we all accepted the fact when the Hawke-Keating Labor government introduced university fees. Not all of us, but you know, the great majority of people. Now we get into that situation where people are saying, is it causing me a little bit of indigestion? Does it mean my grandkiddies can't go to university? Does it mean my kiddies are saddled with debt and I have to go put my hand into the bank of mum and dad, and unfortunately there's no money in the bank of mum and dad because of the type of work I did, you know, over a lifetime? Palatable inequality is becoming unpalatable, isn't it? Then you got health service. You know, you can buy the best health service money can buy. You see $8 to $10 billion of taxpayers' money going to the private insurance industry, directly to the private insurance industry, while we see public hospitals across the country labour under, you know, increase in demands from a population that is chronically ill, that is growing old, that is dealing with the angst of living in a 21st century society where profit for profit's sake is the only God we worship. Palatable inequality. I'm sure you can think of many, 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 many other examples. Because at every available statistical indicator you look at, as I mentioned at the beginning of this little chat, you know, the gap between the rich and poor has increased. And isn't it fascinating? Isn't it funny? We've got increased interest rates, right? Which means increased mortgage repayments, which means small business loans have dramatically increased in terms of the amount of money you've got to pay the bank. And then if you're an investor, you know, you've been pushed into the investing in housing, as the interest rates go up, you pass on that cost to the people renting your property. And then when land tax goes up, you again pass that cost. So rents escalate. And then at the same time, you see that there isn't enough money in the economy because most of it's going to buffet the bank's extraordinary profits in this country. Palatable inequality. And then you've got the unconscionable behaviour of corporations around the country. Palatable inequality. It's extraordinary, isn't it? How much shit does somebody eat before they start vomiting? And that's the situation we face today in the first quarter, the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. How much shit have we been asked to swallow? Think about it. We've got all these government bodies to protect you and protect your interests. And the fact is that most of these government bodies don't have the legislative power to do anything. But they do have the ability to tie you up in, you know, red tape that never ends as you try to get some justice for the situation you find yourself in. And if you're wandering through the city, the CBDs of cities across this country, the number of people who are sleeping rough you've had to walk around, is that palatable? Is it really palatable for a country as rich as Australia to actually put up with this crap? While profits soar, while individuals become billionaires, Well, billionaire philanthropy escalates. You know what billionaire philanthropy is? It's very simple. You as the taxpayer assist some billionaire to keep their names up in light because they've donated money to some worthy cause which they have chosen. That's right, a worthy cause they have chosen, and they get a legal, legitimate tax deduction. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. Even the tax office is beginning to complain. Usually the tax office just likes to beat up little people. They don't like to beat up the corporate sector because they don't have the legislative power to beat up the corporate sector. That's the way it goes. And then you've got our political representatives, which we elect year after year, election after election, on the same hobby horse, on the same hobby horse, telling us we live in an egalitarian community, telling us we've never had it so good, telling us we're the best country in the universe, if not the meta-universe, and the list goes on and on. So how much palatable inequality are you willing to put up with? It's one thing sitting in the corner and going, tut, 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 this is not nice. It's another thing sitting in a corner and saying, I can't deal with this anymore, and where's the next scotch? Where's the next magic pill to make me feel happy? It's one thing sitting in the corner and saying, that's the way it is. You can't fight City Hall. No point. Don't put your head above the parapet, otherwise it'll be cut off. And the reality is that cynicism is the aphrodisiac of the ruling classes. As long as we think that we can't do anything, as long as we think that there's no point, because we're always going to lose, and as long as we, have no hope, no desire for change or expectation for change, things will be the same. Palatable inequality. What are you going to do about it? Well, I do what I can. It's not enough, and I'm sure many of the listeners listening to this program do what they can. But the reality is, unless we're able to get our message to a wider audience, and unless people are no longer willing, to eat bucket loads of that shit that's poured down our throat every day, that the private investment for private profit mantra is the only God we need to worship, well then things will never change. I'm a secretary of a little organisation called Public Interest Before Corporate Interests. You'd think we would be, we want the earth. All we want is the interests of the many to be put before the interests of the few. But the interest we have in this organisation, minimal. Because people think there's no point. So if you are interested, if you want to do something, you're not involved in something, have a look at their webpage, PIBCI, PIBCI.net, and join. It's free. Who knows? Things are changing. What we've accepted as palatable inequality is now becoming unpalatable. And when things become unpalatable, things happen which drive change. And I think, not believe, think that we have now reached that period in Australian history where that palatable inequality is no longer palatable for most people in this country. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. Now, this week is Reconciliation Week. Now, Reconciliation Week is about our relationship as a people with this country's First Nations people, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And Reconciliation Week is bookended by National Sorry Day, which kind of passed without any mention, and Mabo Day, which is the 3rd of June, which apart from far north Queensland and the Torres Strait, where it's a public holiday, it'll pass without minimal mention. You see, we now have a parched reconciliation landscape. The defeat of the Voice referendum has ensured that no government is going to go down that path because the Australian people, for a variety of reasons, rejected the idea of a voice. So which government at the state or federal level is going to initiate or continue that struggle for truth-telling or treaty? Now, a few state governments are trying, but again, the loss of the referendum has taken the momentum out of that movement. So on Reconciliation Week, have a look at what's happening in your part of the town, your community, your regional area. And if there's an activity, go and join them. Have a chat. Join them. Celebrate the week. You may think there's nothing to celebrate about, but in comparison to what things were 100 years ago, there is a lot to celebrate. There's a lot more to be done. And now the Ellen Jose Memorial Foundation, that's my late wife Ellen Jose's foundation. Ellen was a Torres Strait Islander, continues to organise a Mabo Day celebration. And this year is no different. So I encourage you, if you've got nothing to do, we encourage you to join us on Monday the 3rd of June at 12 o'clock at Federation Square, at the corner of Swanston and Flinders Street in Melbourne, under the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags next to St Kilda Road there. Come and join us. Short ceremony, starting at 12. We'll all be over by 1. Just to mark that day, because let's not forget that 40% of the Australian landmass has some native title jurisdiction, and that would never have happened without the Mabo decision. Because on the 3rd of June 1992, the High Court of Australia ended the legal fiction the Australian continent and the islands surrounding Australia were owned by no one. Terra nullius. Over 1 million people lived on Terra nullius before colonisation, but as far as the colonial law was concerned, nobody lived here. So they could just walk in, take what they wanted. It was all legal. And up to 1992, terra nullius was the rule of the land, the law of the land. When Australia was invaded and colonised on the 26th of January 1788, the British colonisers acted as if the land was uninhabited. Yep, one of the great ironies, isn't it? The oldest living culture on the planet, living for over 60,000 years, hadn't happened. Over 65,000 years of civilization was swept away in an orgy of destruction that resulted in the violent dispossession of peoples who had a long and productive association with both the land and the sea surrounding the land. And for 204 years, that's 2 centuries, that's 7 generations, successive Australian governments acted as if the lands they had stolen legally belonged to them, while the original inhabitants who had survived the colonisation process were ignored, marginalised and legally discriminated against. It was all legal, All legal to take their children away. Yep. Legal to take their land, legal to pay them in tobacco, up to the 1960s, and flour for working on the vast cattle stations, many of which were owned by transnational corporations. All legal. In 1982, 3 traditional landowners from the island of Muir in the Eastern Torres Strait, Eddie Koiki Mabo, Father Passy and Grandfather Rice, set in train a series of events that began in Queensland courts and ended up in the High Court of Australia that overturned the doctrine that Australia was unoccupied, terra nullius at the time of the British invasion. Now, this High Court challenge was brought forward by a Melbourne legal firm acting pro bono. The High Court of Australia on the 3rd of June 1992 ruled, that's right, they ruled that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interests, and this is exceptionally important, they ruled that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interests in land and water survive the assertion by force of sovereignty by the Crown. Before that, land rights legislation, which was initiated by the Whitlam Labor government, was restricted to the Northern Territory and the ACT. There was no jurisdiction regarding land rights in any of the states which federated in 1901 to form the country of Australia. Now, this judgment, I was alive during this judgment. I was about 40, 50. The judgment caused consternation amongst Australian landowners. The corporate-owned media, and to a lesser extent the government-gilded ABC, talked as if the end of the universe, the end of civilization had occurred. And people were sitting shotgun on their back porches waiting for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander invasion into their backyards. I know it sounds ludicrous, but that's what it was like. That was the theme. And it didn't take long for the spirit and letter of the Mabo High Court judgment to be buried in bucket loads of extinguishment by successive federal governments. And now by the Australian people through the loss of the voice referendum. What a lot of people have forgotten is referendums in this country are important because referendums give governments a green light. They give governments a green light to move forward on particular issues. And if the voice referendum had succeeded, the green light had been given by the Australian people to go ahead with negotiations for a treaty, because you see, treaties is the relationship and decisions and the end point after, discussion, which occurs between the government of the day and representatives from this country's First Nations people. But a referendum is what gives the government the political courage to move forward on a particular issue, as we saw with the 1967 referendum, which I think was held on the 27th of May 1967, where 90% of the Australian population voted to allow the Commonwealth to take over from the states as far as legislation regarding First Nations people was concerned. Now, 32 years later, that's after the High Court judgment, gave Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders rights to land in Commonwealth law, the question of sovereignty, a voice to Parliament, compensation, the extent of native title, and a need for a treaty between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians continues to be important impediments to reconciliation between First Nations people and the rest of us. And that's why the theme this year for Reconciliation Week is that, it's important. As I said before, Reconciliation Week is bookended by National Sorry Day, Mabo Day. In 2002, the late Ellen Jose, chairperson of the Victoria and Wongai Torres Strait Islanders Corporation, hosted at the Melbourne Town Hall one of the largest Mabo Day gatherings this country has seen to mark the 10th anniversary of the Mabo High Court decision. Since 2003, Ellen Jose organised a Mabo Day ceremony at Federation Square in the face of state opposition and on many occasions, police, security, just went on and on, to mark Mabo Day in Melbourne. Ellen died almost 7 years ago on the 2nd of June 2017 on the eve of the 25th anniversary of the Mabo High Court decision. Ellen Jose was a proud Torres Strait Islander. She was proud of the contribution Torres Strait Islanders have made in that struggle to achieve reconciliation between this country's First Nations people and the rest of us, but a reconciliation based on justice, not charity. It was her express wish that her family and friends continue to organise events and activities to celebrate the gains made on the 3rd of June 1992. So, if you can't make the ceremony, that's fine. Spend a few minutes on Monday thinking about the High Court judgment, thinking about how far we have to go. Because ultimately, it's us. It's us which pressures the governments of the day to enter into negotiations with First Nations people for treaty. It's nobody else. And the failure of the referendum has put back that battle for decades. You're listening to The Anarchist World this week via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. I think palatable is the phrase of the day, isn't it? How about palatable suffering? Now, we all know that the Australian media is, brilliant media, isn't it? Corporate-owned media, the government-gelded ABC, even-handed, tell it as it is, Bit surprised. I think 24 hours ago, some idiot wrote some graffiti on a private school, Jewish private school in Melbourne, and it was headlines, national headlines. Not idiot writes graffiti, but anti-Semitism at its height. Everybody was interviewed, they all pontificated, and as they pontificated, palatable suffering continued in Gaza. And it's fascinating when you look at the Australian media. I love this, the government-gelded ABC. Now, when the Russians are what's the word? They commit an atrocity in the Ukraine, we hear the Ukrainians talk about that atrocity, right? But we never hear any Russian government representatives give their side, all right? Because obviously, why would you give the Russian aggressors airtime to explain away that atrocity? Now, because we're into palatable suffering in this country, when the Israeli Defence Forces are guilty of an atrocity, we hear the people who are guilty of that atrocity try to explain it away. I mean, the ABC says it's even-handed. But the fact is, we don't hear from the other side. Because you see, Hamas is a designated terrorist organisation. But the State of Israel, although its Prime Minister and Foreign Minister have been branded as, guilty of war crimes, and the International Criminal Court has stated categorically that a ceasefire is necessary in Gaza and that collective punishment, including starvation, including starvation, is a central issue in this particular struggle. But what do we get in the Australian media? I'm not going to even mention the corporate media. I mean, it's full of pro-Israeli propaganda. But we get the Australian, and then we get reporters who suddenly lose their jobs because they've used the word genocide, or because, their directors and their managers somehow think they've gone a little bit too far in terms of describing the suffering of the Gazan people. Not talking about Hamas, but the suffering of the Gazan people. It's as if it's palatable, isn't it? If somehow somebody, some Palestinian somewhere is undergoing extraordinary dehumanisation and suffering, it doesn't really matter, does it? Because it's palatable, isn't it? I mean, Israel is our ally in the war against who knows what. And somehow it's palatable. And if we can weaponise anti-Semitism as a wedge, well, the Australian media does everything it can to weaponise it. Just extraordinary. Palatable suffering. Palatable suffering. Doesn't matter the images which come out of Gaza. Our governments shrug their shoulders. Mr. Biden says, tut, tut. Penny Wong says, Mr. Albanese, missing in action. Mr. Dutton, the opposition leader, we want more of these atrocities. Palatable suffering. So when does suffering become unpalatable to us as a people? Think about it. I think if, 36,000 Australians, most of them, over half children and women and elderly, had been killed in this extraordinary way, that, maybe we'd jump up and down. So just look at the way the Russian invasion of Ukraine is portrayed and the Israeli invasion of Gaza is portrayed. And you can actually understand, irrespective of what whether you support Israel, whether you support Palestinians, whether you support the Ukrainians, the Russians, but it's the way it's reported. And the reporting is important because it moulds public opinion. And if you create this climate that Palestinian suffering is palatable, what happens is that you just increase that suffering. And then on top of that, if you enable, that's right, that beautiful word we use, enable the person committing the atrocity, never mention it. Don't mention our military relationship with the State of Israel. Don't mention the university's relationships, those misguided protesters, who tried to raise that issue. Don't mention it. Don't mention it. So this is a classical example, not just as far as Palestine, Israel, Russia, Ukraine is concerned, but it's a classical example of how the Australian media is manipulated to support the status quo, whether it's the increasing inequality in this country, which is slowly becoming unpalatable to a majority of people, or whether it's the palatable suffering of Palestinians in these successive atrocities, the fact is that ultimately, if you leave the complaining to somebody else, nothing will change. And that's the key. I mean, I can sit here and talk for the next 28 years non-stop, put a catheter in so I don't have to go to the toilet, get a colostomy bag on, But the fact is, as we see with the state of Israel, it doesn't matter what Biden says, it doesn't matter what Wong says or Albanese says or Macron says, unless they're willing to put boots on the ground, these atrocities will continue because the suffering of the Palestinian people is palatable to us in the West. Now, I'd like to thank the Israeli Defence Forces. Yes, I know, you must think I'm mad, but look, there is recruitment strategies and recruitment strategies. Now, Hamas must be beside themselves, not in terms of the militants they've lost in the battles and the surrounding carnage. They must be so happy that the Israeli Defence Forces have now become their most successful recruiter. Now, could you imagine if you find yourself in Gaza where you're limited to a litre of water a day if you're lucky, for your personal hygiene as well as drinking? That's half the recommended dose. Where you've got to use sand to put out fires in refugee tent cities because there's no water while people burn to death. While you're forced to live on minimal amounts of food, while trucks after truckload after truckload are lined up outside the border waiting to get in, but being denied entry by the Israeli Defence Forces. Now, obviously, for every Hamas militant that is killed, it seems that another 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or a dozen Palestinians join the resistance fight with Hamas. Because atrocities amongst a colonised population create resistance. So of all those supporters of the Prime Minister and the current state of Israel and the current state of Israel's strategy, a strategy which has lost them friends, which they built up over 7 decades in most of the world, a strategy which has fanned the flames of anti-Semitism. And let's not forget, there are anti-Semites in all societies, including Australian society, and they are loving this situation and making the most of it. The fact is that it was the Israeli Defence Forces which let the Israeli people down in October when Hamas broke out of Gaza. I mean, we were told that Mossad is the world's best intelligence agency. And you've got thousands of armed Gazans crossing the boundaries. And the Israeli Defence Forces is missing in action because they're too busy expanding settlements in the West Bank to worry about what's going to happen in Gaza. So look, I could go on, but again, palatable suffering. When does palatable suffering become unpalatable suffering? Think about it. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Fear. Fear is a great method by which to create authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, oligarchs. Fear. Fear, fear, fear. Fear of the other, the person wearing a funny hat, the woman with a thing on her head, the person wearing a crucifix, the person with a funny, looks different, the person who speaks different, person of a different colour, fear. And the thing is, the Liberal National Party under Mr Dutton, who hopefully will be removed, from as leader, believes that they will be able to be re-elected on a campaign of fear, whether it's about immigration, whether it's about particular, racial groups in society, whether it's about China, whether it's about, what's happening in the Middle East. The list goes on and on. Whether it's about crime, fear. So we have a duty. That's right. You and I have a duty, believe it or not. We have a duty to counter this fear campaign, because fear creates difficult situations for all of us. Because the use of fear is a common tactic which is used by people who want to gain power. And it's a great mobilising force, as we saw in Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy and Pol Pot's Cambodia and Stalin's Russia. Fear, fear, fear. And to think that at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, that we continue to have major political, media, corporate figures who are pushing fear as their main tactic in order to maintain their wealth and power. I mean, it's nothing new, but you would think in a so-called sophisticated era with an educated population that fear wouldn't have the same effect. But unfortunately, as we see with all these virtual platforms, that fear is a great way to put eyeballs on these virtual platforms to increase their advertising revenue. The more outlandish, the more eyeballs, the more advertising they can ask to pay, the more payments they can ask the advertising sector to put their way. So, if you hear people talk about the fact that there's an explosion of youth crime, there's an explosion of this, there's an explosion of that, we need to do this, we need to close the borders, try to use a bit of reason. I know reason is difficult, but sometimes reason does have effects. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, again, inquiries, all right? We've just had a government inquiry into regional banks and the fact that the regional banks, the big four, have closed over, I think, 3,000. That's right, 3,000 banks. And it's very, very difficult for people to actually do their banking. Now, I know they want us all to go on the internet and, trust them. I mean, I do a bit of banking myself, and it's interesting that every time I walk into a bank, there's some poor bastard there complaining about the fact that they've had their account hacked because they've been, forced on the net. And I watched an interesting exchange last Friday, and that's why I said at the beginning of the program, isn't it funny? This elderly couple, look, I'm elderly, but these people are more elderly than me. They come in, they say there's discrepancies in their internet account. They're concerned people are taking money out of them without authorisation, and they want the bank to do something about it. So the gentleman, and he was a nice, pleasant chap, obviously was doing what he's been told to do. The gentleman gave them a phone number to ring. Right? The local branch couldn't help them, but they'd give them a phone number, which they were very grateful for. So they'll wander out of the bank, they'll try to ring that phone number, they'll wait hours for somebody to answer it, and then they'll be given platitudes and not get their money back. And that's why some people still like to go into a brick and mortar bank. And that's why some people, sick and tired of the fees and charges which they have to pay if they use the net, prefer to use cash. So there was a government inquiry and it came up with a few little things. You know, community bank, sounds good. You know, resurrect the Commonwealth Bank, this and that. But guess what they didn't do? They didn't actually ask the Big Four to re-establish regional banking. I went to a regional bank on Friday. It's another bank. There was a line-up which went outside the door. People trying to resolve issues. So you see, banks have licences to trade. These licences are provided by legislation by the government of the day. So why wouldn't you think that this committee that supposedly looked at this important problem, which is affecting the National Party vote in the regions, and that's why the National Party is quite concerned about the closure of regional banks, why wouldn't this little committee recommend that as part of their licence obligation, they have to provide a brick and mortar bank in every Australian community that has more than 5,000 people? Maybe not all of them. They could take it in turns. Why didn't it recommend that? And if they don't follow the rules, take away their licence, suspend their licence. Oh, it won't get to that because they'll be crying before you get to that level. They'll be crying. So this is the dilemma. We're given solutions which are no solutions. And this is what happens when you've got large entities, call them corporations, call them what you like, call them virtual platforms, are able to make profound impacts on government legislation to protect their bailiwick, to protect their profits. Extraordinary. I'll give you another example. Virtual platforms. Everybody's saying virtual platforms are a law unto themselves. Well, this is nothing new. We had the same problem, we continue to have the same problem with transnational corporations. Transnational corporations are a law unto themselves. Virtual platforms are a law unto themselves. Because governments aren't willing to legislate in order to curtail their influence. I mean, we belong to a private investment for private profit culture. And over the last 40 to 50 years, I know you're bored with this, but over the last 40 to 50 years, we have allowed these monstrosities, these megaliths, to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger to such an extent that they now dominate the legislative agenda. Look at the recent advertisement I spoke about last week from the mining sector, wanting us to hug them and love them because they paid $65 billion in taxes and royalties last year or the year before. A multi-billion-dollar industry that's raking in the profits, that is making extraordinary profits for its major shareholders, and we're supposed to be happy they only paid $63 billion in taxes and royalties. Don't forget that, and royalties, considering all the corporate welfare that goes in their direction, considering that we've given it away. Well, at the same time, the people of Norway, I think, have $2 to $3 trillion in a future fund, which the successive Norwegian governments have collected from transnational corporations, which they have allowed to mine their natural resources as long as they pay a decent return to the people of Norway. But here, you mention a super profits tax and we see the demise of a Prime Minister. We see, the billionaires of the world standing on the back of trucks denouncing the fact they may have to pay a little bit extra tax for the welfare of the people of this country. Extraordinary. See, this is what I'm saying. It's funny, isn't it? It's funny. They prosper, you pay. Knock on the door, phone call, email. You haven't paid us this week. When are you going to pay us? We're going to bankrupt you. We're going to take you to court. You haven't got enough food? I don't care. I want that money back. That's the way it goes. So virtual platforms are nothing new in terms of the type of reach and the type of power they can exercise. And unless we force, that's right, FORCE, governments to regulate in order to protect us, then nothing changes. I'll give you an example. Tulpuddle martyrs, 1834, found themselves in Australia for creating a friendly society of agricultural labourers in southern England. Same struggle. They wanted to move forward. They wanted a greater share. They wanted to be able to feed their kids, put a roof over their heads. But it didn't happen. But the reality is in 2024, that's right, 200 years later, almost 200 years later, nothing has changed. It's illegal to strike in this country outside enterprise bargaining agreement period. So much legislation has been passed to basically deny people the ability to withdraw their labour in this country. And we talk about the Russians and the Chinese and, oh, come on, give me a break. You listen to the Anarchist World this week. One last little comment. I noticed the Sandstone University is a little bit upset because governments are talking about decreasing the number of fee-paying foreign students, and they're crying, Paul. You know why? Because there won't be any money for research. Well, boys and girls, isn't that extraordinary? Our governments cannot provide so-called publicly owned universities, which do an extraordinary amount of research, enough resources for them to continue to carry out that research, that they have to rely on a private sector which in many regards dominates the type of research which is actually carried out by the university because, he or she who pays the piper calls the tune. So instead of the Sandstone Universities crying poor because there's going to be less private money going into their research facilities, isn't it about time they put a bit of pressure on the government of the day to actually fund research? And that's what public is all about. It's all about. That's what the public sector is all about. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. My name's Joseph Toscano. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489. Those of you who can come to the Mabo celebrations in Melbourne, see you at midday on the 3rd. That's Monday the 3rd of June. Otherwise, all I can say is join public interest before corporate interests, or have a look at their website. Come along to the activities that are organised. If you can't, organise your own activity, because ultimately it's you who will make the difference. It's not your religious leaders, your political leaders, your social leaders, your cultural leaders. The virtual platform, you're a slave to, it's you. And that's what we've forgotten. Change comes from people taking action. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week. And local listeners, don't forget about the Radiothon in 2 weeks' time.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's Sacred Cow Slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
3CR Radiothon 2024. Sound on for solidarity.
Did you enjoy listening to that podcast? 3CR is a community radio station, and you, the listener, are a part of that community. Right now, it's our radiothon. We need you to pitch in with a few dollars to keep the station going. We can't do it without you. It's easy. Head to 3cr.org.au/donate. Your donations really matter.